You understand, the majority of people harbor ambitions of enlarging their ranch, perhaps incorporating a few additional acres or a new pasture. It simply never crossed my mind that I would accomplish this by, in essence, taking control of the exact homeowners association that attempted to evict me from my own property. Seems utterly preposterous, doesn't it? Akin to an illusion from a high fever. Well, prepare yourselves, folks, because you are about to learn precisely how a power-hungry HOA president and her compliant board members provoked a tranquil, peace-loving rancher beyond his limits. This tale, this specific account of suburban conflict, is truly one for the records. It encompasses spreadsheets, county archives, numerous sleepless nights, and ultimately, a rather gratifying alteration in the local balance of power. I am referring to my family's ranch, the Barm, a place that has been integral to our heritage for 3 generations, long preceding the construction of the first ostentatious portico of Whispering Pines Estates on land that was formerly Old Man Hemlock's back 40. My grandfather established this place through sheer grit and unwavering resolve, and my father developed it further with hard work and astute judgment. I inherited not merely the land, but also the legacy, the serene cycle of the seasons, and the duty of stewardship. It signifies more than just an asset. It is my heart, my personal history. By profession, I am an agricultural engineer. I dedicated a solid decade to designing sustainable agricultural systems throughout the nation before returning home to manage the Barm on a full-time basis. Consequently, I possess a thorough understanding of land. I comprehend infrastructure, and I most certainly grasp the concept of boundaries, both in the literal and metaphorical sense. The difficulties commenced subtly, as such matters frequently do. Whispering Pines Estates had emerged approximately 5 years earlier, a collection of uniform beige houses with identical mailboxes, all densely packed onto a tract of land adjacent to my eastern fence. For the most part, we had managed to coexist. I would offer a wave if I encountered someone walking their pedigreed poodle. They, in turn, would largely disregard the distant lowing of my cattle or the occasional scent of genuine manure carried on the breeze. A philosophy of live and let live, or so I believed. Then, about a year passed, a new HOA president was chosen over in that development. Her name was Brenda Culper, a woman who appeared to have confused her minor administrative responsibilities with those of a feudal overlord. Brenda operated a gleaming, oversized white SUV, the type that has never encountered a single speck of dirt, and she had a preference for brightly colored pantsuits that seemed to declare, "I am the one in authority here." Her hair was a helmet of an unlikely blonde shade, and her smile never quite managed to reach her eyes. The initial piece of correspondence was a courteous, almost comically formal letter, delivered via certified mail, no less. It stated that a particular ancient live oak, one beneath which my grandfather had likely enjoyed picnics and which stood a good 50 yards within my property boundary, was impeding the scenic view for certain residents of Whispering Pines. They put forth a request for its felling. I gave a little laugh, composed a polite response clarifying that the tree was situated on my private land, constituted a beloved landmark, and, quite frankly, possessed greater seniority than their entire housing development. I assumed that would resolve the issue. Oh, how mistaken I was. That letter represented merely the initial volley in Brenda Culper's campaign to transform my life into an ordeal. Subsequently, there were grievances regarding unpleasant agricultural smells. Then, I observed that my century-old barbed wire fence, the one marking a boundary that had been undisputed for a period longer than Brenda had likely been alive, failed to meet community aesthetic criteria and required replacement with a more aesthetically pleasing white vinyl picket fence, at my own cost, naturally. Each letter grew more strident, more insistent, referencing HOA bylaws that, from my perspective, were being fabricated as needed and held absolutely no authority over the Barm. I began to suspect this was not merely about a tree or a fence. This concerned something more significant. A private conversation with one of me more senior ranch hands, a man named Earl who had witnessed a great deal, corroborated my growing apprehension. He'd overheard some chatter at the feed store. "That new HOA lady, Brenda," he'd said, expelling a stream of tobacco juice. "She's been informing people that her 5-year plan involves enhancing the western approach to their estate. And can you guess what is located on their western approach, boss? My ranch, my residence." It appeared Brenda Culpepper desired more than just an improved vista, she coveted my land. The sheer impudence of it, the unadulterated nerve, ignited a slow burn deep within me. This was no longer just an annoyance, this constituted a menace to everything I treasured. My first efforts at sensible dialogue were met by a patronizing smirk from Brenda and vacant expressions from her board members during a short, calamitous attempt at a neighborly discussion to which she had summoned me at their small community clubhouse. "Mr. Morgan," she had uttered, her voice suffused with feigned sweetness. "We merely wish to guarantee that Whispering Pines continues to offer a premier residential experience. Surely you can appreciate that your rustic operations somewhat diminish that." Rustic? My family had been cultivating this land, making contributions to the local economy and acting as responsible environmental stewards long before her premier residential experience was even a conceptual drawing. I understood then that the niceties were over. This woman, this HOA, had initiated hostilities, and if it was a confrontation they sought, well, I was an agricultural engineer. I possessed the knowledge to cultivate a strategy and bring it to fruition. The sheer effrontery of that rustic operations remark reverberated in my thoughts for days. It was not merely offensive, it represented a fundamental misapprehension or perhaps a willful disregard of what my ranch stood for. This was not some leisure farm. It was an operational enterprise, a heritage, and the economic backbone for several families who relied on it for their income. My immediate action was to contact my legal counsel, Tom Chalmers, a seasoned, old-school country lawyer who had been handling property disagreements since before my birth. Tom listened with patience, nodding as I detailed the escalating demands and the poorly disguised threats from Brenda and her HOA. "Well, son," he remarked, reclining in his squeaky leather chair. "At first glance, they don't possess any legal standing. Your property is not affiliated with their association. It never has been. Their bylaws are about as pertinent to you as the regulations of a Tiddlywinks club in Timbuktu." That was comforting, but Tom swiftly introduced a note of caution. "However," he went on, tapping a pen on his desk, "that doesn't preclude them from making your existence unpleasant. Nuisance lawsuits, baseless complaints to county departments. Individuals like this Brenda thrive on conflict and dominance. They can ensnare you in complications and drain your finances with legal costs if you aren't vigilant." He instructed me to keep records of everything. Every letter, every exchange, every subtle threat. "Compile a file, son, a substantial one." And so I complied. I transformed into a painstaking archivist of Brenda Culpepper's escalating despotism. Yet, documentation by itself felt insufficient. I needed to comprehend my adversary. I resolved to conduct an in-depth investigation into Whispering Pines' estates and its administrative body. My background in engineering had instilled in me the importance of understanding systems, and an HOA is, fundamentally, a system, though frequently a flawed one. I commenced by acquiring their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CCRs, and their official rules. Perusing them was a task of interpreting bureaucratic jargon intermingled with surprisingly trivial mandates. Everything, from the exact hue of beige a house could be painted to the sanctioned types of shrubbery adjacent to mailboxes, was stipulated. It depicted a meticulously controlled thief, and Brenda was unmistakably its self-proclaimed monarch. Following that, I directed my focus towards their financial records. This proved more challenging. HOAs are typically private organizations, but occasionally, contingent on their organizational setup and state regulations, certain documents are publicly available. I allocated a few afternoons to the county records office, a venue with which I was already acquainted from overseeing the ranch's deeds and water entitlements. I also had a discreet conversation with a cousin of mine who specialized in forensic accounting. She provided me with some guidance on what to search for, the indicative markers of improper management or financial discrepancies. Although I did not uncover any definitive proof of wrongdoing in their finances straight away, I did observe that their beautification fund appeared unusually substantial and that Brenda wielded considerable discretionary authority over expenditures. Intriguing. My inquiry into the board members proved equally revealing. The majority appeared to be retired individuals, easily influenced or simply averse to causing trouble. A few, nonetheless, seemed to be Brenda's close associates, equally committed to the perceived status of Whispering Pines. One board member, a reserved man named Arthur Jenkins, consistently seemed ill at ease in the board meeting minutes I managed to informally procure through a disgruntled resident whom I had carefully cultivated as a contact. This resident, a woman named Mrs. Gable, was an elderly widow who had initially been captivated by the notion of a managed community, but was becoming progressively disenchanted with Brenda's authoritarian governance and escalating fees. She turned into an invaluable, though wary, informant. She would phone me periodically, her voice a hushed, conspiratorial tone, to apprise me of the most recent HOA conflicts or a particularly outrageous new regulation Brenda was attempting to implement. The truly significant discovery, however, emerged when I began to scrutinize the property documentation for the entire Whispering Pines development with meticulous care. I obtained the original plat maps, the property deeds, and all related easements or land utilization agreements. I dedicated many hours to cross-referencing these with my own ranch's historical survey records. My grandfather had been exceptionally particular about precise boundaries, and I had inherited his comprehensive maps and annotations. It was painstaking work, comparing meets and bounds, verifying survey markers. But my engineering expertise came into play. I started to discern patterns, interconnections, and then I located it. An irregularity, a specific detail concealed within the original developer's master plan for Whispering Pines. The developer, a firm named Apex Holdings LLC, had evidently encountered financial difficulties shortly after finishing the primary construction phase of Whispering Pines. They had divested themselves of most of the individual plots, yet they retained ownership of several crucial common areas: the small park, the grounds of the clubhouse, and most notably, a lengthy, undeveloped tract of land that served as a demarcation between the final row of houses and my eastern fence line. This tract was not merely any ordinary buffer. It was marked on some older blueprints as a prospective access easement, although it was currently just overgrown vegetation. Crucially, Apex Holdings LLC also continued to possess the declarant rights for the HOA. These rights, frequently kept by the initial developer, can bestow considerable authority, such as the power to select board members, overrule certain board decisions, and even modify the CCRS under particular circumstances. And Apex Holdings LLC, based on the most recent public filings, was barely financially viable. They were delinquent on their property tax payments for these remaining land parcels. While all this investigation was in progress, Brenda remained active. The letters persisted, each one more hostile than the previous. There was a grievance regarding dust generated by my tractors during the planting season, dust that had been a customary aspect of agricultural activity in this valley for more than a century. Then followed a truly peculiar demand, that I reduce the noise pollution emanating from my cattle, specifically their lowing. I half anticipated a directive to equip them all with miniature Boyne voice-suppressing collars. They even attempted to involve the county by submitting a formal grievance to a zoning official, a young man by the name of Henderson. Fortunately, Henderson was a local individual who comprehended the distinction between an operational ranch and a suburban ideal. He visited me, listened to Brenda's representative, one of her more confrontational board members, present their argument regarding incompatible land utilization, then walked along my fence line with me, observed my well-maintained operation, and, in essence, advised the HOA representative to cease their efforts, albeit in more polite language. "Mr. Morgan's ranch predates your development by nearly a century," Henderson had declared calmly. "He is operating well within agricultural zoning regulations. I recommend you find a method to coexist." This minor triumph was encouraging, yet Brenda resembled a particularly stubborn bulldog. She was not inclined to surrender. The harassment simply adopted a more passive-aggressive quality. Abruptly, no trespassing signs oriented towards my property materialized every 10 feet along their side of the fence, as though my cattle were plotting a clandestine assault on their petunias. It was all so trivial, so deeply exasperating. But with the knowledge concerning Apex Holdings, their retained privileges, and the undeveloped land, a novel, audacious concept began to take root in my thoughts. What if I could employ their own organizational framework, their own regulations, to my advantage? What if the answer lay not merely in defense, but in launching an offensive in a manner Brenda Culper could never foresee? The notion was audacious, almost preposterous. Yet, the more I examined the maps and the legal papers, the more it began to appear achievable. The critical juncture, the instance when my simmering exasperation transformed into cool, methodical determination, arrived as an official-looking envelope, thicker than the norm, adorned with the Whispering Pines Estates emblem. Inside, amidst several pages of quasi-legalistic verbiage, was the ultimatum. Not a request, not a proposition, but a formal, unambiguous ultimatum that I halt all commercial ranching activities within 500 feet of their closest property line. And, even more astoundingly, that I cede and transfer a 20-acre strip of my eastern pasture to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association for the creation of community green space and recreational facilities. They even possessed the audacity to propose a token compensation amount that was likely inferior to the worth of the fencing enclosing that pasture. It was, effectively, an eviction order from land I rightfully possessed, issued by an organization with no conceivable authority to make such a demand. My hands were genuinely trembling as I perused it. This was no longer mere harassment. This was an undisguised effort at a land appropriation disguised in the flimsy pretense of community enhancement. Brenda Culper had, at last, definitively overstepped. I recall strolling out to that eastern pasture, the very land they were endeavoring to seize. My cattle grazed without disturbance. The sun was descending behind the western hills, creating long shadows. This land had sustained my family, cared for us, and served as the setting for generations of cherished moments. The mere idea of relinquishing even a fraction of it to that conceited, avaricious woman and her coterie of sycophants imbued me with a righteous indignation I hadn't experienced in years. That evening, I did not find sleep. Instead, I arranged all my investigative materials on the large oak table in my ranch office. The plat maps, the deeds, the details concerning Apex Holdings LLC, Mrs. Gables's whispered intelligence, Tom Chalmers' legal summaries. All the elements were present, dispersed like an intricate jigsaw. And gradually, throughout the caffeine-stimulated hours of the early morning, a strategy began to materialize. It was bold, intricate, and potentially quite costly. But the alternative, a lengthy legal war of attrition against an unyielding HOA, or worse, succumbing to their preposterous demands, was out of the question. My significant finding regarding Apex Holdings LLC, their financial difficulties, their ownership of those crucial common area parcels, and, most importantly, their retention of declarant rights was the cornerstone. If Apex was experiencing hardship, they might be amenable to divesting their remaining Whispering Pines' assets and liabilities for a fair sum. And if I could obtain those assets, those rights, well, that would entirely alter the circumstances. The declarant rights, in particular, represented a possible decisive advantage. In numerous HOAs, these rights bestow upon the original developer or their successor substantial powers, occasionally even permitting them to overrule the board on specific issues, particularly those related to development and common areas. My initial action was to discreetly confirm the present condition of Apex Holdings. My cousin, the forensic accountant, intrigued by the prospect, conducted some investigation. It emerged that Apex was on the verge of insolvency. They were urgently seeking to dispose of assets, any assets, to appease creditors. Their Whispering Pines' holdings constituted a minor, almost disregarded component of their overall portfolio. However, to me, they were invaluable. The subsequent step involved making contact with them. This needed to be executed with caution. If Brenda learned I was investigating Apex, she might attempt to obstruct my efforts, perhaps even submit a competing bid. Though I doubted the HOA possessed the financial resources for a substantial acquisition without imposing a massive special assessment that would undoubtedly anger the residents. Tom Chalmers suggested employing a third-party go-between, a land acquisition expert he knew, to establish the first communication. We formulated a proposal to acquire all of Apex Holdings' remaining land parcels situated within and adjacent to Whispering Pines' estates, in addition to any and all associated privileges, including the declarant rights. The initial offer was modest, considering Apex's dire situation, but sufficiently reasonable to be considered seriously. While these sensitive negotiations were unfolding discreetly, managed through intermediaries of lawyers and representatives, Brenda Culper, entirely oblivious, was intensifying her efforts. She had somehow persuaded a local, small-scale newspaper journalist, eager for any form of controversy, to publish a prejudiced article concerning the ongoing disagreement between the beleaguered inhabitants of Whispering Pines and the uncooperative rancher. The piece depicted me as an irrational recluse, stubbornly adhering to an obsolete lifestyle and callously ignoring the anxieties of my newer, more modern neighbors. It included statements from Brenda about her aspirations for a tranquil and visually appealing community, implying that my ranch was the chief impediment. My telephone began to ring with calls from worried friends and even distant family members who had read the article. It was exasperating, but I understood that a public response would only serve Brenda's agenda. I needed to maintain my focus on the larger objective. Mrs. Gable proved to be an unforeseen advantage during this time. She telephoned one evening, her voice quavering slightly. "Mr. Morgan," she whispered, "Brenda is organizing something significant for the upcoming HOA meeting. She's terming it a community action strategy session concerning the Barn Ranch encroachment matter. She has been informing everyone that she has a legal team prepared to initiate a major lawsuit if you fail to adhere to their most recent demands. She has even had pamphlets printed." This intelligence was vital. It provided me with a schedule. Brenda was orchestrating her decisive maneuver, her checkmate. Little did she realize I was preparing my own. The discussions with Apex Holdings were strenuous but advanced consistently. They were, as anticipated, keen to divest. The price we ultimately settled on was considerable, necessitating me to use some of the ranch's assets as collateral and draw upon savings I had allocated for future enhancements. But I viewed it as a strategic expenditure, an investment in tranquility, in my family's heritage, and yes, in a substantial measure of retribution. The legal documentation was intricate. Tom Chalmers and his associates labored persistently, ensuring every detail was perfect, every twist. We were in the process of acquiring not merely land, but a formidable legal standing. The conveyance of the declarant rights was the most essential element. At last, the day arrived. The transaction with Apex Holdings LLC was finalized. I was now the proprietor of several pivotal land parcels within Whispering Pines' estates, encompassing the tract of land adjacent to my ranch that Brenda so desired for her community green space. More significantly, I was now the successor declarant for the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. The balance of power had undergone a monumental and imperceptible shift. Brenda Culpepper was entirely unaware. She was excessively preoccupied with her preparations for her community action strategy session, honing her figurative claws for what she anticipated would be her conclusive triumph over the obstinate rancher residing next door. I, conversely, was quietly re-examining the Whispering Pines CC rupees, this time from an entirely different standpoint, not as an external party, but as the possessor of ultimate authority. The Community Action Strategy session was set for a Tuesday night at the Whispering Pines Clubhouse, an unassuming structure that Brenda regarded as her personal Versailles. Mrs. Gable had furnished me with the particulars. Attendance was highly recommended for all inhabitants, and Brenda had alluded to a significant declaration that would ultimately settle the ranch predicament. I could only surmise the pompous address he was composing. For a couple of days following the finalization of the Apex transaction, I maintained a low profile. I intended for Brenda to carry on with her agenda, to proceed directly into the snare she was oblivious to. There was a certain somber contentment in anticipating what was to occur, a sensation comparable to observing a storm gather on the horizon while one is securely sheltered. Tom Chalmers recommended that I be present at the meeting. "It is preferable if you are there personally to convey the information," he had remarked with a subtle grin, more potent. He also proposed bringing duplicates of all pertinent legal papers, the deeds, the assignment of declarant rights, all correctly filed with the county. "Allow the documents to speak for themselves," he had counseled. Thus, on that Tuesday evening, I donned a fresh shirt and my least worn pair of boots, collected my substantial file of documents, and drove my pickup truck not merely to the periphery of Whispering Pines, but directly into it, securing a spot in one of the visitor parking spaces near their clubhouse. I could sense the gazes upon me as I proceeded towards the entrance. A handful of residents, out walking their canines or retrieving their mail, paused and observed me. I was, in effect, the antagonist in Brenda's version of events. The clubhouse was a hive of activity. Brenda had truly excelled herself. There were trays of anemic L-looking biscuits, a thermos of diluted coffee, and, as Mrs. Gable had forewarned, piles of leaflets titled "Reclaiming Our Community," a plan for action regarding the Bar M nuisance. At a small D's at the front of the room, Brenda was presiding, resplendent in a power blue pantsuit, her blonde coiffure gleaming beneath the fluorescent illumination. Her inner circle of board members stood beside her, appearing suitably solemn and consequential. She noticed me as I came in, and a brief expression of something, surprise. Then a sense of victory flickered across her features. She likely presumed I was present to make a plea, or perhaps to finally yield. I located a chair at the rear, resting my substantial folder on my lap. The gathering commenced with Brenda delivering a lengthy, digressive oration on community principles, property worth, and the intolerable imposition upon the inhabitants of Whispering Pines by my discourteous and antiquated farming methods. She depicted a scene of serene suburban existence perpetually beleaguered by the sights, sounds, and odors emanating from my ranch. She mentioned children unable to play outdoors due to dust, a flagrant overstatement, and tranquil evenings disrupted by the sound of a remote tractor, a sound I, for one, found rather calming. Then followed the significant declaration. With a theatrical gesture, Brenda revealed a substantial architectural illustration. It showed my eastern pasture converted into a park featuring a gazebo, walking paths, and a children's play area. This, she proclaimed, her voice resonant with certainty, is our aspiration for the days to come, a splendid green area for all residents of Whispering Pines to utilize. And we have commenced legal measures to transform this aspiration into actuality if Mr. Klaus Morgan does not come to his senses and agree to our magnanimous proposition to buy this underused segment of his property. A sparse round of applause ensued, predominantly from her steadfast supporters. Some attendees appeared uneasy while others were simply bewildered. She then detailed the community action strategy, which encompassed appealing to county commissioners, initiating a media offensive, more of what I had already encountered, and, if required, a generously financed lawsuit to compel my adherence through eminent domain claims that were, frankly, absurd in this situation. This was my signal. I rose to my feet. The chamber fell silent. Every gaze shifted towards me. Brenda appeared momentarily disconcerted, then regained her composure, a self-satisfied smile gracing her lips. "Mr. Morgan," she remarked, her tone laden with condescension, "I observe you chose to attend. Perhaps you have regained your wits and are prepared to consider our entirely reasonable offer." "In fact, Miss Culpepper," I stated, my voice composed and unwavering, "I am present to discuss several recent events of my own." I proceeded to the front of the chamber, placing my folder on the table next to her ludicrous illustration. As of 3 days past, through a legally established organization, finalized the acquisition of all residual assets of Apex Holdings LLC related to Whispering Pines' estates. A low sound passed through the assembly. Brenda's smile wavered. "This includes," I continued, extracting the initial set of deeds, "the tract of land commonly referred to as the buffer strip along my eastern boundary, the very land shown in your charming illustration there. It also encompasses the land on which this clubhouse is situated, the community park, and various other undeveloped common areas." Brenda's complexion was gradually paling. "Moreover," I stated, my voice level, "and perhaps most critically, this purchase incorporates the complete and lawful transfer of all declarant rights for the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." I positioned the assignment document, properly stamped and filed by the county clerk, directly before her. "Which signifies, Miss Culpepper," I declared, looking her straight in the eye, "that I, or more accurately, my entity, am now the declarant." The stillness in the room was utter, so profound one could almost spread it on bread. Brenda merely gazed at the papers, then at me, her mouth somewhat open. One of her board associates, a stout man who invariably parroted her views, stammered, That's not feasible." "Oh, I guarantee you it is quite feasible," I replied, tapping the officially recorded papers. "And it is entirely lawful." Tom Commerce, my legal counsel, ensured every particular was addressed with utmost care. "Perhaps you are acquainted with him." The reference to Tom's name. "An individual whose reputation for thoroughness and expertise in land law was renowned in our county appeared to extinguish the last vestige of resistance in some of them." Brenda at last regained her voice, though it was a ready, trembling rendition of her customary forceful tone. What does this imply?" she inquired, directing her gaze not at me but at the documents, as if they might provide an alternative explanation. "It implies several things," I elucidated. "Firstly, your intended community action plan concerning my ranch is irrelevant. You cannot reasonably initiate legal proceedings to obtain land for a community park from the entity that now possesses that land and also wields ultimate authority over your HOA's decisions regarding common property. Secondly, as declarant, I possess certain entitlements and obligations. These encompass, under Article X Section 3 of your own CCRS, the prerogative to authorize or reject any suggested modifications or constructions of common areas, and under Article 12, the authority to select a majority of the board members should specific prerequisites be fulfilled or upon the regular conclusion of current tenures." I paused, allowing that information to be absorbed. "It also signifies," I proceeded, taking one of her leaflets, "that this barm nuisance campaign is formally concluded." The harassment ceases immediately. I surveyed the room. Some expressions conveyed astonishment, others a dawning realization. Mrs. Gable, situated at the rear, was genuinely smiling, a smile of authentic relief. My aim, I declared distinctly, is not to act as a despot. My family and this ranch have been established in this valley for an extended period. We advocate for being amicable neighbors. Nevertheless, we also champion the respect of property rights and refuse to endure unfounded hostility. I redirected my attention to Brenda. Her countenance was a study in incredulity and rage. The power blue pantsuit abruptly seemed less a representation of command and more like a gesture's attire. Regarding this land, I remarked, motioning towards her illustration and then towards the window overlooking my pasture, the land you were so eager to reclaim. It will, in fact, be utilized productively. It will become an addition to the Barm Ranch. It will furnish supplementary grazing for my livestock and perhaps a new access way for my machinery, which paradoxically will likely diminish dust on the principal thoroughfare. The Whispering Pines estates, or at minimum substantial portions of it previously under Apex's ownership, is, in reality, now integrated into the ranch. The profound and delightful irony of the situation was not unappreciated by me, and judging by some of the looks in the room, by others as well. The pursuer had not merely become the pursued, the pursuer had acquired the entire blooming forest. Brenda Culpepper did not accept her loss of status with composure. For an instant, I believed she might actually propel herself across the table. Her complexion transitioned from pallid to a mottled, incensed crimson. "You can't, do this," she shrieked, her voice faltering. "This is our neighborhood. These are our residences. We possess entitlements." "You do possess entitlements as individual property owners," I responded serenely, my collection of legal papers a mute affirmation of the altered circumstances, and I fully plan to honor those entitlements. However, the HOA as an organization, and specifically its present leadership, has egregiously exceeded its jurisdiction in its interactions with me. As the new declarant and proprietor of significant common properties formerly managed by Apex, I possess the legal authority to amend that. One of her board confederates, a gaunt, anxious man who had consistently just agreed with her, actually began to breathe excessively fast into a paper serviette. The other, more aggressive one, started to mumble about legal actions, but his bravado was unconvincing. He understood, or was swiftly starting to comprehend, that they had been strategically overcome. The rest of the attendees exhibited a mix of astonished quietude and hushed dialogues. A handful, I observed, appeared almost thankful. Brenda, nevertheless, was unprepared to yield. She attempted to muster her supporters. "He is attempting to cow us. He is attempting to demolish Whispering Pines," she declared, glancing about erratically for backing. But her momentum had dissipated. The irrefutable significance of the recorded deeds and the assignment of declarant rights resting on the table before her was overwhelming. Her authority, constructed on pretense and the compliance of her board, had vanished when confronted with irrefutable legal reality. The gathering fell apart in confusion. Brenda uttered a few more sputtering menaces, but the majority of individuals simply desired to depart, to assimilate what had just transpired. As I collected my documents, Mrs. Gable came over to me, her eyes luminous. "Mr. Morgan," she uttered softly, "my gratitude. You cannot imagine what some of us have endured." Several other inhabitants, individuals with whom I had never previously conversed, offered me nods of recognition, even quiet expressions of encouragement as they departed. It appeared Brenda's oppressive governance had been more pervasive than I had comprehended. In the subsequent days and weeks, the ramifications of my acquisition started to spread throughout Whispering Pines. Brenda Culpepper, characteristically, attempted to resist. She retained legal counsel, a flamboyant urban attorney, who dispatched a few menacing letters replete with empty threats and references to inapplicable legal precedents. Tom Commerce dealt with them through concise, factual replies, highlighting the unambiguous wording of the CCRs and the indisputable lawfulness of the Apex transfer. Brenda's legal offensive collapsed before it even reached a courtroom. Her backing on the HOA board also fell apart. Confronted with the new circumstances of my declarant rights, which encompassed the authority to designate new board members as terms concluded or positions became vacant, even her most devoted allies started to create distance. One tendered his resignation, attributing it to health concerns. Another abruptly resolved to dedicate more time to his grandchildren. Within a matter of months, the board's makeup was markedly different, one more disposed towards rationality and authentic community welfare than towards trivial assertions of power. Brenda herself grew progressively more alone. Her declarations, previously regarded as undeniable truth, were now predominantly disregarded. The premier residential experience she had presided over had undergone a fundamental transformation. The most gratifying aspect for me was initiating the tangible process of integrating the recently obtained land into the BARM. The buffer zone that Brenda had desired for her park was cleared of its dense undergrowth, not for a decorative structure, but for productive grassland. My livestock soon grazed peacefully where Brenda had pictured meticulously kept flower gardens. I even constructed that new access route for my agricultural machinery, utilizing the long-neglected easement. It did, as I had foreseen, lessen vehicular movement and dust on the primary road that bordered a section of whispering pines, an unexpected advantage for the inhabitants. The communal spaces I now managed, such as the little park and the area surrounding the clubhouse, also underwent alterations. The excessively ornate landscaping was progressively supplanted by more indigenous, drought-resistant vegetation. The interminable catalog of stringent regulations concerning lawn upkeep and home adornments within Whispering Pines, over which, as declarant, I now wielded substantial influence via Amending 9, were discreetly amended to prioritize safety and fundamental maintenance rather than aesthetic authoritarianism. The monotonous beige uniformity gradually began to accommodate a greater degree of personal style. Certain residents were at first apprehensive, uncertain of what to anticipate from their rancher quasi-proprietor. However, I explicitly stated that my objective was not to meticulously control their existences, but merely to guarantee that the HOA operated equitably and refrained from overstepping its authority, particularly in relation to my ranch. I even convened an informal gathering with the residents, not within the clubhouse, but on the newly cleared pasture strip, to address inquiries and articulate my purposes. I discussed principles of responsible land stewardship, of fostering good neighborly relations, and of achieving an equilibrium between residential life and the agricultural legacy of the valley. The majority of individuals were amenable. They were weary of the conflicts, weary of the internal strife, and, frankly, weary of Brenda's ever-increasing fees for initiatives that never seemed to serve anyone's interests but her own vanity. As for Brenda Culpepper, her decline was precipitous and, from my standpoint, entirely merited. Divested of her authority and sway, she became merely another inhabitant, albeit an exceedingly embittered one. The vibrant pantsuits appeared to lose their luster. The white SUV was observed with diminishing frequency. Ultimately, approximately 6 months thereafter, a for sale placard materialized in front of her dwelling. Rumor had it she was relocating to a different state, possibly in search of a new, unsuspecting community to attempt to control. I did not purchase her residence, though the notion briefly provided me some amusement. I possessed sufficient land. The ultimate destiny of the Whispering Pines HOA itself continues to unfold. Possessing my declarant rights, I hold the authority to either disband it or fundamentally reorganize it. Presently, it functions under a new, more sensible board, with significantly simplified and less meddlesome regulations. The primary concern is now essential services, not the imposition of personal preferences. My legal expenditures for the Apex acquisition and the ensuing minor confrontations with Brenda's attorney were considerable. Yet, as I survey my enlarged eastern pasture, observing my cattle graze on land that was once the focus of so much dispute, I deem it a worthwhile investment. It was not solely about obtaining land. It was about safeguarding my heritage, my tranquility, and confronting a tyrant. The incident evolved into something of a regional anecdote. The rancher who acquired the HOA, it possessed a certain appeal. Other individuals in the county who had experienced their own conflicts with officious HOAs would occasionally contact me for counsel or simply to exchange a moment of levity. Reflecting on it, the experience was a taxing, all-encompassing trial, yet it imparted valuable lessons regarding the significance of understanding one's entitlements, the worth of thorough investigation, and the unexpected avenues of influence one can uncover with diligent effort. Brenda Culpepper believed she could employ the trivial authority of her small association to cow and dispossess me. She fundamentally misjudged my attachment to my land and my determination to safeguard it. She envisioned my ranch as a minor detail in her grand scheme for Whispering Pines. Instead, Whispering Pines, or at least a substantial portion of its core framework, became a fresh chapter in the chronicle of the Barn Ranch. So, that is the method for handling a power-intoxicated HOA that insists you vacate. You don't merely oppose them. You acquire their entire residential area and integrate it into your ranch. It was an exhilarating experience and certainly not an approach I would advocate for every circumstance, but in this instance, it proved to be the ideal and entirely lawful retribution.